Mrs. Elizabeth is 50-year-old widow who lived in Lagos, Nigeria. She was a wealthy woman who worked in a bank and was respected by everyone around her. People admired her for her success and confidence, but deep inside her, she felt lonely since her husband died years ago. She hadn't found anyone to love again. She missed the feeling of being loved and cared for her only child, Chibike, who was her pride and joy. Chibike, a 27-year-old hardworking and cheerful young man, was very close to his mother. He loved and respected her deeply, and they had a strong bond. Mrs. Elizabeth always said Chibike reminded her of her late husband. Chibike had a best friend named Emeka. Emeka was 28 years old and very handsome. He was charming, confident, and funny. He had been friends with Chibike for many years, and Chibike always trusted him. Emeka often visited Mrs. Elizabeth's house, and she treated him like family. It was December, and the holiday season had begun. Chibike decided to invite Emeka to stay at their house for the festive period. It was something they did every year, and Mrs. Elizabeth didn't mind having Emeka around. The first day Emeka arrived, Mrs. Elizabeth noticed something different about him. He wasn't just the funny, friendly young man she had known for years. That day she noticed how attractive he was. He was tall, well-dressed, and had a confident way of speaking. For the first time in many years, Mrs. Elizabeth felt butterflies in her stomach. At first, she was confused why I am feeling this way about my son's best friend. She tried to ignore it, but every time she saw Emeka around the house, her feelings grew stronger. She started to see him differently, not as her son's friend, but as a man she could fall in love with. Mrs. Elizabeth hadn't felt this way about anyone since her husband passed away. She was surprised by her emotion, but couldn't stop herself from thinking about Emeka. Emeka didn't notice Miss Elizabeth's feeling at first, but as time passed, he started to feel something too. He couldn't ignore how elegant and graceful she was. Mrs. Elizabeth wasn't just beautiful, she was smart and confident. Emeka admired her strength and independence. However, he was scared how he could tell Chibik that he had feelings for his mother. He knew Chibiki would never accept it. He felt guilty just thinking about it, but his feelings kept growing every time he was alone. He imagined what it would be like to be with Miss Elizabeth. One day, Emeka decided he couldn't keep it a secret anymore. He had to tell Chibike the truth, no matter how difficult it was. He knew it could destroy their friendship, but he didn't want to lie to his best friend. One afternoon, Emeka gathered all his courage and went to Chibike's house. Chibike was in the living room watching a football match on TV. Emeka sat beside him looking nervous. Bro, there's something I need to tell you, Emeka said, avoiding eye contact. Chibike laughed, thinking it was a joke. What is it? Did you break up with another girl again? No, it's serious, Emeka said firmly, that it's about your mom. Chibike's smile disappeared. He stared at Emeka, confused. About my mom? Emeka hesitated but finally said, I have feelings for her. I think I'm in love with her. Chibike's face turned red with anger. What did you just say? He shouted, standing up. I know it sounds bad, but I couldn't hide it anymore. I respect you, but I love her, Emeka explained, trying to calm him. Chibike couldn't believe his ears. He grabbed Emeka by the shirt. You're joking, right? You want to date my mother? I'm not joking, Chibike. I'm serious about her, Emeka said, pulling away without warning. Chibike punched Emeka in the face. You're a disgrace. How could you even think about this? You're supposed to be my friend. Emeka wiped the blood from his lip and said, I'm sorry, but I can't help how I feel. Chibike pointed at the door. Get out of my house and don't you dare come near my mother again. If you do, you'll regret it. Despite Chibike's warning, Emeka and Mrs. Elizabeth couldn't stay away from each other. They began meeting in secret. Mrs. Elizabeth was nervous, at first knowing how upset her son would be if he found out. Emeka, are you sure about this? She asked. One evening, as they met in a private restaurant, "Yes, I've never been more sure of anything," Emeka replied, holding her hand. "You're everything I've been looking for, and I don't care what anyone thinks." Mrs. Elizabeth smiled for the first time in years. She felt loved and appreciated. She began to trust Emeka more and more. They spent time together going on dates and talking about their future. One evening as they walked by the beach, Emeka said, "I want to be with you forever. I don't care if Chibike hates me for it. I'll prove to him that I'm serious about us. I hope he understands one day," Mrs. Elizabeth said, leaning on his shoulder one night. Emeka arrived at Mrs. Elizabeth's house with a bouquet of roses. He was dressed in a suit and looked nervous but excited. "Why are you so dressed up?" Mrs. Elizabeth asked, laughing. "I have something important to say." Getting down on one knee, Mrs. Elizabeth gasped, covering her mouth. "Emeka, what are you doing?" He pulled out a small box and opened it, revealing a diamond ring. "Elizabeth, you've changed my life in so many ways. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Miss Elizabeth's eyes. She nodded and said yes. "Yes, I'll marry you." They hugged and Emeka slipped the ring onto her finger, but the surprises weren't over. A few weeks later, Emeka visited Mrs. Elizabeth with more flowers as they sat in the living room. She held his hand and said, "There's something I need to tell you." "What is it?" Emeka asked. "I'm pregnant," Mrs. Elizabeth said softly. Emeka's eyes widened. "Pregnant, are you sure?" "Yes, I took a test. You're going to be a father," she said, smiling nervously. Emeka smiled and hugged her. "This is amazing news. We're going to be a family." Chibike had been avoiding Emeka and his mother ever since the confrontation. But one day, while scrolling through social media, he saw a photo that stopped him cold. It was a picture of his mother wearing an engagement ring with Emeka by her side. The caption read, "Forever and always. Can't wait to spend my life with you." Furious, Chibike stormed into his mother's house that evening. He found her in the living room sipping tea. "Mom, what is this nonsense I'm seeing online?" he shouted, throwing his phone on the table. Mrs. Elizabeth looked at the photo inside Chibike's phone. "I was going to tell you, Emeka and I are getting married." Chibike's jaw dropped. "You're marrying him after everything I told you, after I told him to stay away from you." "Chibike, I understand you're upset, but Emeka makes me happy," Mrs. Elizabeth said calmly. "I haven't felt this way in years." "What are you even saying, Mom? He is my friend. He cannot be with you. Find someone else, please." Chibike yelled, "I don't care if he is your friend. He makes me happy and we are meant to be together," she said. Chibike clenched his fists. "You've already made your choice. Don't expect me to support this madness." The day of the wedding arrived. The venue was beautifully decorated with golden chairs and white roses. Everywhere, guests were arriving in their finest clothes, and photographers captured every moment. Emeka stood at the altar, looking confident, while Mrs. Elizabeth prepared herself in a dressing room. She was nervous but excited to start a new chapter in her life. Swing. Chibike sat in his car outside the venue, his heart pounding. He stared at the gun on the passenger seat, his mind racing. He couldn't believe his best friend and his mother had done this to him. "I warned him. I warned both of them," Chibike muttered to himself. He grabbed the gun and tucked it into his jacket. As the ceremony began, Chibike slipped into the back of the hall unnoticed. The guests clapped as Mrs. Elizabeth walked down the aisle, looking stunning in her wedding gown. When the officiant asked if anyone objects to this union, "Speak now, or forever hold your peace," Chibike stood up. "Objection," he shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. The room fell silent. Mrs. Elizabeth gasped, and Emeka turned. "Chibike, what are you doing here?" Emeka asked nervously. "You think I'd let this happen?" Chibike said. Pulling out the gun, the guests screamed and ducked under tables as Chibike pointed the gun at Emeka. You betrayed me. Emeka, you were my best friend and you stabbed me in the back. Chibike yelled, Chibike, please put the gun down. Emeka pleaded, raising his hands. We can talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. Chibike shouted, I warned you, but you don't listen. Mrs. Elizabeth stepped forward, her hands trembling. Chibike, stop this. Please put the gun down, she pleaded. You should have thought about that before you choose to get married to my best friend. Chibike shouted in a fit of rage. He pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the hall as Emeka collapsed to the ground. Mrs. Elizabeth screamed and ran to Emeka holding his lifeless body in her arms. Chibike stood frozen, staring at what he had done. Then the police arrived moments later, arresting him as he dropped the gun and fell to his knees. I didn't want it to end like this, Chibike whispered as they took him away. Subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories. What would you have done if you discovered your mom or dad was in a relationship with your best friend and was about to get married? Drop your thoughts on the comments section.